is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition is a special, as we're joined by a person who's no stranger to our audience, Dr. William Seraile, Professor Emeritus of African and African American Studies at Lehman College. Welcome back.
Thank you very much.
Well, when I think about this next topic, really is home for you. You are an educator of decades of educating on the academic level on African American and African studies. And as you know, over the last few years, the study of African history has become a subject of criticism by some members of the society who feel that it somehow is challenging the paradigm of American or the established thought as it relates to American history, not realizing that it is part of American history. But to state, to give people an understanding of the need for the study of African history, African and African American studies history, can you please tell us about the early beginnings? When did the need for capping a curriculum that focuses on the history of people of African ancestry in America became relevant in this society?
Yes, and we have to go back to the 19th century. At that time, you had individuals and you had organizations that began to disseminate knowledge about the African American experience. 1897, you had the American Negro Academy, comprising many intellectuals, people that were pretty well known at that time and some today, people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Alexander Crummell, John Edward Bruce, and others. And these were scholars who would give papers annually discussing some aspect of either Africa or African American culture and history. You also had in the year 1911, John Edward Bruce and Arthur Schoenberg in Yonkers, New York, started the Negro Society for Historical Research. That was international because they had members in England, France, West Africa, and the United States and the Caribbean. And that lasted a few years because in 1915, Carter G. Woodson started the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which still exists today as African American Life and History. But also he had a journal called the Journal of Negro History. Today it's called the Journal of African American History. And here you had scholars who basically were rejected by the white scholars associations, historical societies. They're able to publish these articles. So that's the sort of a genesis of interest. However, in the 1960s, with the civil rights movement in the first half of the 60s, but then Black Power in the second half, you had students who got agitated and began to say, why can't we learn about ourselves? One example here in New York City, City College, Brooklyn College, where I taught Lehman College. In the case of Lehman, students wanted to have a course on the Black child in the urban environment and the Puerto Rican child in the urban environment, because they said many students at Lehman were going to be teachers. They should have some kind of knowledge of the culture of these two groups. Well, that effort got turned down, and people who were inspired by the Black Panthers and Malcolm X decided to take action into their own hands. And so what they did, they took over buildings. And by taking over buildings, they brought attention, but also they brought fear. And the fear was Lehman College in the Bronx wasn't that far from South Bronx with a lot of Puerto Ricans, and not that far from Harlem with a lot of Black people. So the fear was that maybe community would get involved. And the same is true of City College, which is in Harlem, that fear of the community getting involved. So as a result, these colleges began to offer Black Studies Department and Puerto Rican Studies Department. The same thing happened at Cornell University, the same thing happened in San Francisco, and then eventually throughout the country. So Black Studies got established, and in the formative years, in the late 60s, early 70s, it was primarily Black students taking these courses, maybe a few from Africa and some from the Caribbean. And over the years, it became broader and became more universal in the United States, where a lot of students, regardless of background and race, began to take these courses.
So you mentioned about the progression of the interest, particularly the history of our sojourn here, and then, of course, how as time moved on through the civil rights movement as well as the Black Power movement, that there became interest in studying and knowing more about our history and disciplines of study, focusing specifically about the experience of people of African ancestry here became a demand in terms of curricula. I recall as a student my experiences with coming in contact with professors who were teaching about our history and how great and refreshing it was to really be able to learn about us. Whereas in high school, it was a challenge because dealing with some of the non necessarily people of African ancestry, people who are not of African ancestry, not focusing on that and feeling somehow not connected to the history of our people. So it was a refreshing change for me as a student in the 1970s in college and high school. Now, when you think about the programs that have been started, when you talk about that, we think about the fact that the first Black Studies program is credited to be in San Francisco, okay, State University in 1968, which led to the creation of similar programs across the country. And how, particularly, I wanted to ask you as an educator, what about your experiences with teaching African studies? What were the sentiment of the students about learning and about the society in terms of this discipline being created?
You mentioned San Francisco, and people like Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, who became famous with the Black Panther Party, were students at that time. And they were the ones, too, who began to advocate for what we call ethnic studies or Black studies. And it spread. I mean, at Cornell University, students had to have weapons because they were threatened just trying to have these programs. Here in CUNY, City University of New York, students were arrested because they took over the buildings, they trespassed in a way, so they got arrested. I came in February 1971. The program at Lehman was only there for about 2 or 3 semesters. And students had a lot of power at that time because they were the ones who organized these departments and even chose some of the courses that were offered. So I came in and I taught African American history. And we had other people. We had people from Africa teaching Yoruba and Swahili. So our department, and probably typical of many departments, we had courses on the Caribbean, African American, Africa, history, culture, politics. And this went on, but we had problems in 1976 because the city of New York was going to go bankrupt. And a lot of our professors were not kept on because they hadn't had tenure. We had around 15 at Lehman full-time people. Most of us were not professors in the sense of having PhDs. We were ones who were considered as on that level be lower than a PhD. So a lot of people lost their jobs. Fortunately, I kept mine. And over time, we began to expand in terms of the number of students that we had because a lot of the Black students resented having white students at that time. They thought they were going to learn too much or going to learn secrets. And I told them, look, anything I teach in the class, you can go to the library and you can find this. But we began to expand, and I ended up in the year 2007 when I retired, and I had students from all over the world at that point. I had students from India, Pakistan, from Ecuador in South America, from the Caribbean, from Ethiopia, from Nigeria and Ghana, and throughout the United States. It became okay in a way because what Black Studies did over the years was to introduce new concepts of knowledge. So there are new theories about slavery, certainly more theories about the family. There are more introductions to what we call really American history, because all American history is includes African American history. And so African American studies, Black studies, were able to inspire other people. So as a result, in the early 70s, began to give studies on women, studies on Native Americans, Dominicans, and other groups that were before ignored, which is really important because it gave the student population certainly a much broader perspective of history. And it really did a lot for the profession of history. Today, the journals of history, like Journal of American History, we have a list of all the publications that were published recently, like books, but also articles. And they have a section in there devoted to African American studies and women's studies. And this is a reflection of the growth within the historical profession to give that kind of recognition. And the reason why we go back to 1916 with the Journal of Negro History is because the established journals in American history ignored the contributions of scholars, whether white scholars or black scholars, about African American history. Now today, it's a given. You're going to have this in there because the knowledge is so profound that you can't ignore it anymore. Which brings us down to the present time with CRT and the critical race theory and the whole question about what's the future of Black studies, Africana studies? Is it something that we continue the way it has been for almost 60 years? Or is it going to be so watered down that it's not worth very much?
Dr. Seraile, can you tell us who put Black history on the map in the 20th century?
Yes, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who had a PhD from Harvard University, but he was one who got ignored by the historical profession in terms of the journals. That's why he started in 1916 the Journal of Negro History, following the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which still, as I said, still continues to the present time. What he did was to make sure that scholars, whether white scholars or black scholars, had a opportunity to get published. And there are a lot of articles. The journal comes out twice a year, and you can go to the libraries. Schoenberg has all the copies going back to 1916 in the Journal of Negro History. But also he started a Negro History Bulletin, which was used for school teachers. And also he was the originator of what became Negro History Week, that people now call Black History Month or African American Month. He wanted to make sure, and you got to think about what he did, because he was around and publishing and maintaining the association throughout all the years, like the Great Depression, during the war years, and until he died in 1950. What's significant about this is when I first came to New York in 1965, I was in Peace Corps in Ethiopia, and I had seen ancient ruins of Aksum and Lalibela, and that inspired me to learn more about Africa. So when I came to New York in 65, I came across the Journal of Negro History and all those wonderful articles about our contributions. So that inspired me to want to learn more, so I did. And in a way, I sort of taught myself, because I never had a course undergraduate, and I only had one course on the graduate level on African American history. So I was inspired by Dr. Woodson to do the research on my own, which basically led me to being a professor myself at Lehman College.
When you think about what inspired Carter G. Woodson to go into this field, to do this work, and I think about a story that you told me of your own experience where you were in class, we had a professor, I think it was Mr. Leroy, and his version. Can you tell us about that experience you had?
Yeah, as undergraduate, I went to Central Washington State College, which is now Central Washington University, and I had a class probably like 1962. Paul Leroy, little short white guy with red hair, I remember him. And he had a course. It was the first time the course was offered. It was called History of Africa Since 1800. So I was really excited because I was majoring in social science, and I had courses like history of Mexico and Russia, and European history and American history. So here's the chance to take a course on African history. But the disappointment was it's all about Europeans, because the prevailing viewpoint was that Africa had no history except the presence of Europeans in Africa. And so that was very disappointing for me. And fortunately, now people can now take degrees in African history and as well as African American history.
Now, another question here is when we talk about the future of Black studies, one thing, the fact that there's a focus now on really interdisciplinary studies where people should be identifying the role of Africans in science, math, humanities, and so it's not just limited to one aspect of study. So that's a progress, okay, that particularly during African American History Month, people talk about Black scientists, Black and all over so looking at African studies as a human experience, an experience of all people that everyone should learn, not just children of African ancestry, but it's something that we all need to embed in the curriculum. I want to go to another aspect, and you talked about this whole impact of the pushback against Black history. Basically, critical race theory, where certain people of the other community who feel that somehow the study of African history or Black history is countering the dominant story about American history. Tell us about the importance of us ensuring that Black history is not removed from the history books as it's starting to happen right now.
Well, the fear of some people is that exposing history as a reality. The reality of history is a lot of things, violence, atrocities, so forth. And when I talk about history, African American history, I do talk about lynchings because it's part of American history. I talk about discrimination, segregation. Some people want to have this all covered up because they feel probably ashamed. So they're pushing not to have this in curriculums. I mean, Florida is a good example where they want to talk about slavery as if it was a job training program where someone could learn some skills they could use after slavery ended, instead of looking at slavery as a form of exploitation, of dehumanizing people. And so you have to fight against this just as well as against people trying to ban books. If you're going to ban a book because the book is talking about segregation or it's talking about integration in a way where children went to schools that were white schools and they were met by crowds of people who were very antagonistic towards them, who used violence to try to keep them out of these schools. That's history too. So you got to talk about these kinds of things. Unfortunately, if people don't know these things, then they don't understand why things are happening today. Why today do you have incidents, say, against migrants, not knowing anything about the history of migration to the United States? See, if people knew about the history of migrations, then they understand there was anti-Catholic, anti-Irish, anti-Polish sentiments 150 years ago.
So that is so critical, as you stated, the importance of us studying the history and keeping the African experience in the history, because it not just impacts us, but it also impacts new arrivals and who are facing discrimination. It really reminds certain members of the society who may have been here a couple of generations earlier that they too were victims of the same type of isolation and discrimination that some of them are enacting on others today. And the fact that history will repeat itself if we don't continue to study it. With that said, for those young people who are sitting on the other side of the tube, who are listening to you right now, who may be considering entering the field, tell us the importance of young people considering history as a major, as whether it be an educational thing, the importance of embracing African history. talk to that. I just want to imagine talk to that child across the street. Might be a child interested, as well as that parent who may be feeling as though our history is an issue for their child to learn. So,
Because you learn things about yourselves. I always try to teach with the perspective of my students learning about themselves. If I talked about, say, slavery, for example, and I talked about some people did not want to buy goods produced by slaves, like tobacco or cotton. They wanted to find it produced by people who were not slaves. And I asked the students, if you were living back in those days, would you buy slave-produced goods? And the class would say, no, no, no. And I would say, you buy Nikes or you buy shoes that come from countries that are being exploited by labor in order to save money. And then they begin to realize that it's kind of difficult for them to make a choice, not knowing that they're also adding to exploitation. So they're putting them back into history. But on a more personal level too, I had students who would tell me things that they learned in my class. I'll give you two examples. One was a student from Israel who I showed the movie, The Battle of Algiers, about the Algerian Revolution. And there's something in the movie, it might have been one of those points where people getting checked as they're walking through and being pulled aside because they're suspicious. There's something about the movie, but also my course on civil rights. And she told me, and she told the class, that Israel needed a civil rights movement. Now that's rather amazing because here she is from Israel, and she comes to America to see and hear about something about American civil rights or civil rights in Algeria, and come to that conclusion that her own country, Israel, needs a civil rights movement. I had a student from Pakistan, also in the same course in civil rights movement, and she told the class, she learned from the class that she had rights, and she wasn't going to let any old man marry her or let her family send her back to Pakistan. Because her fear was, I'm graduating, they're going to send me back home to celebrate with the relatives. I have an American college degree, and they're going to try to have me marry some old man. In her case, the old man was someone like 50, and she was like 21. So that's on a very personal level. But the thing is, we have the history, and when I was in school, all I learned was about white people, white Americans, Europeans, and I didn't know anything about our contributions, whether it was to build up the West as cowboys, our homesteaders, about our roles as explorers, our roles as inventors. All this stuff was foreign to me because I didn't think about it because I had no exposure whatsoever. So today, I mean, fortunately, a lot of the schools, my grandchildren are in private schools, and they tell me things they learned that I never had knowledge of. I know today, but not at the time I was their age. And so they're looking at civil rights, they're looking at racism, they're looking at the kind of exploitation that's part of our historical background.
thank you so much, Dr. Seraile, for sharing with the vast knowledge as it relates to our history, culture, and the importance of the study of African American studies as it's part of the American story. And that's something people have to remind, that this is not isolated, but it's a part of the story that has been left out for decades that needs to be adopted. And certainly for those who may feel concerned, that they need to be educated too as to understanding why it's important, and hopefully that will happen. But we encourage you. I just want to say, we hope you've enjoyed this broadcast, and we continue to encourage you to tune in and to write and to tell a friend. But until next time, Louise Dente saying thank you.
Cultural Caravan TV can be seen 24/7 on youtube.com at ccptv.org/Louise Dente or Roku TV. Get the Roku TV phone app for Android and iPhones to the Cultural Caravan past and present episodes.